History is a battlefield, and truth is the first casualty. Welcome to the History Frontline. Picture this. It's January 1942. Somewhere on the frozen killing fields of the Eastern Front, a German soldier huddles in a foxhole. The temperature is 30 degrees below zero. His hands are numb, his stomach is empty. The official rations haven't arrived in 3 days. Around him, the darkness is broken only by the occasional flare that turns night into a brief, hellish daylight. He reaches for his radio, not for comfort, not for hope, just for distraction. Anything to escape the reality of this frozen grave. He turns the dial. Static, more static. Then suddenly, music cuts through the interference. But not the stiff, martial anthems of the Reich. This is something forbidden. This is jazz. Real American jazz. The kind of music the Nazis banned as degenerate. The kind that makes you forget, just for a moment, that you're supposed to be a perfect Aryan soldier. The soldier glances around nervously. Is anyone listening? Can anyone hear what he's listening to? The music fades. A voice emerges, speaking German. But not the formal, precise German of official broadcasts. This voice speaks in pure Berlin slang, the rough, working-class dialect of the streets. The voice of someone who understands what it's like to be hungry, cold, and forgotten. The voice begins to complain about the party bosses back home, about how the fat cats in their warm offices are stealing food meant for the soldiers, about how officers are living in luxury while boys are dying in the snow, about corruption at the highest levels, about lies and betrayals. The soldier nods along. Finally, someone is telling the truth. Finally, someone understands. This must be a secret resistance station. Some brave Germans fighting back against the system from within. He is wrong. The voice he's hearing isn't coming from Berlin. It isn't coming from a resistance movement. It's coming from a quiet studio in a leafy suburb of London. The man speaking perfect Berlin slang is a defector, sitting in front of a British microphone, reading from a script written by British intelligence officers. The soldier doesn't know it yet, but he's just become a target in the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation the world has ever seen. This is the story of Britain's secret mind war, a war fought not with bullets and bombs, but with lies, rumours, and carefully crafted deceptions. A war where the battlefield was the human mind itself. We all know the heroic story, the story we learned in school. Britain standing alone against the Nazi tide, Churchill's defiant speeches, the Battle of Britain, the Blitz, the stiff upper lip, truth versus lies, democracy versus tyranny, good versus evil. That story is true, but it's not the whole truth. Because while the BBC was broadcasting to occupied Europe with news and hope, another organisation was doing something very different, something darker, something the British government desperately wanted to keep secret. This organisation was called the Political Warfare Executive, the PWE. Most people have never heard of it. That's intentional, because the PWE wasn't created to tell the truth. It was created to lie, to deceive, to manipulate, to poison the minds of the enemy from within. Their weapon had a name: black propaganda. Not white propaganda, which is truthful information from an identified source. Not grey propaganda, which is partially truthful information from a disguised source. Black propaganda is pure deception. False information presented as if it comes from within the enemy's own ranks. The British didn't invent psychological warfare. Humans have been using deception in war since the Trojan horse. But the British perfected it. They industrialized it. They turned it into a science. And they were terrifyingly good at it. The PWE operated from a nondescript building in London. No signs, no badges, no uniforms. Just ordinary-looking men and women walking in and out, carrying briefcases full of lies. Inside, they ran fake radio stations. They printed forged documents. They created rumors designed to spread like viruses through enemy territory. Their mission was simple: undermine German morale, create suspicion. turn soldier against officer, turn officer against party, turn party against SS, fracture the unity of the Reich from within. But there was a problem. A psychological warfare campaign only works if the enemy believes it. And that requires something most people think the British are terrible at. It requires lying convincingly. The traditional British establishment didn't understand this new kind of warfare. The generals and admirals were men of honor. They believed in fighting fair, by the rules, according to conventions. The idea of using deception, of pretending to be something you're not, of deliberately spreading false information, it all seemed rather ungentlemanly. But this was total war. And total war requires total commitment, including a commitment to fight dirty when necessary. So the PWE went looking for people who understood the German mind, people who could think like the enemy, people who could lie in perfect German and make it sound like truth. They found their weapon in the most unlikely place. A British journalist who had spent years in Germany, a man who had interviewed Hitler face-to-face before the war, a man who spoke German so perfectly that Germans thought he was German, a man who understood not just the language, but the culture, the humor, the fears, and the hatreds. His name was Sefton Delmer, and he was about to become the most dangerous liar in Britain. But before we meet him, you need to understand what the PWE was up against. German propaganda was sophisticated. Goebbels was a genius at controlling information. The Nazi Party had spent years perfecting the art of the big lie. They controlled every newspaper, every radio station, every newsreel. They had turned propaganda into a religion. How do you fight someone who has already convinced millions to die for a lie? The answer, the British discovered, wasn't to shout louder. It wasn't to tell the truth more forcefully. The answer was to whisper, to get inside the enemy's head, to become a voice they trusted, and then, once that trust was established, to slowly, carefully, poison everything they believed. This wasn't warfare as soldiers understood it. This was something new, something that made many people uncomfortable, because it required becoming, in some ways, like the enemy. It required abandoning the moral high ground and descending into the mud. But war isn't fought on the moral high ground. War is fought in the mud. That German soldier, freezing in his foxhole, listening to forbidden jazz and angry complaints about party corruption, he's just heard the opening shot in a new kind of war. A war he doesn't even know he's fighting. A war where the enemy doesn't wear a uniform and doesn't fire a gun. A war for his mind. Over the next few hours of this investigation, we're going to descend into the shadows of British psychological warfare. We're going to meet the twisted geniuses who weaponized lies. We're going to examine the techniques they used, the fake radio stations, the forged documents, the carefully crafted rumors, the deliberate sacrifices. And we're going to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the good guys, the heroes we celebrate, were also masters of deception. That winning the war required tactics that would have been called evil if the other side had used them. The line between propaganda and truth is thinner than you think. The line between psychological warfare and brainwashing is almost invisible. Welcome to the invisible battlefield. Welcome to the war for the mind. Welcome to Britain's secret psychological operation. The soldier in the foxhole finishes listening to the broadcast. He turns off his radio. He looks out at the frozen wasteland, and somewhere, deep in his mind, a seed of doubt has been planted. He doesn't know it yet, but that seed will grow, it will spread, and it will corrode his faith in everything he's been told. That's how psychological warfare works. One mind at a time, one doubt at a time, one lie wrapped in truth at a time. The British establishment didn't like Sefton Delmer. He made them uncomfortable. He was too German, too familiar with the enemy, too willing to get his hands dirty. The kind of man who belonged in journalism, perhaps, but certainly not in warfare. That discomfort was exactly why he was perfect for the job. Delmer was born in Berlin in 1904. His father was a British professor, teaching in Germany. Young Sefton grew up speaking both English and German fluently, without accent in either language. He attended German schools, he played with German children, he absorbed German culture like a native. By the 1920s, he had become a journalist, covering German politics, and he had a gift for getting access. He charmed his way into inner circles. He interviewed the rising stars of the Nazi Party. He met Hitler personally, multiple times, long before the world knew what Hitler would become. He remembered those meetings clearly. Hitler's intensity, the way his eyes seemed to bore into you, the way he could switch from charm to rage in seconds. Delmer saw the madness early. He just didn't realize how far it would spread. When war broke out in 1939, Delmer returned to Britain and tried to join the military. They rejected him. Too German, they said, can't be trusted, might be a spy. The same qualities that made him valuable made him suspect. So he went back to journalism. And that's where the political warfare executive found him. They approached him in 1941. The war was going badly. France had fallen. Britain stood alone. The Blitz was pounding London every night. Conventional warfare wasn't enough. Britain needed new weapons, unconventional weapons, psychological weapons. They needed someone who understood the German mind, someone who could speak to Germans as if he were one of them, someone who could lie convincingly in perfect German, someone who had no illusions about fighting fair. They needed Sefton Delmer. The proposal was simple. Create fake radio stations that pretended to be German resistance broadcasts, stations that would sound authentic enough that German soldiers would trust them, and then use that trust to spread demoralization, confusion, and dissent. Delmer understood immediately. This wasn't about converting Nazis into Democrats. This wasn't about winning hearts and minds. This was about psychological sabotage, about corroding the enemy from within. He accepted, but he had conditions. First, no oversight. He needed freedom to lie as outrageously as necessary. No committees, no censorship, no nervous officials worrying about propriety. If the PWE wanted effective black propaganda, they had to let him be ruthless. Second, access to defectors. Real Germans who understood the slang, the culture, the current jokes and rumors circulating in Germany. People who could make the broadcasts sound authentic. Third, resources, studios, transmitters, writers, technicians, money to bribe informants in neutral countries who could report back on what German soldiers were actually saying and thinking. The PWE agreed. Desperate times required desperate measures. Delmer's philosophy was simple, but revolutionary. Most propaganda, he believed, failed because it was too obvious. It told the enemy what to think. It lectured, it moralized, it tried to convert. That never worked. People don't change their fundamental beliefs because a foreign radio station tells them to. They just tune out. But what if you didn't try to change their beliefs? What if you confirmed their existing suspicions? What if you made them angrier at their own leaders than at the enemy? Delmer understood something crucial about human psychology. People don't trust outsiders. But they do trust people who seem to be on their side. People who share their complaints. People who confirm what they already secretly believe. His strategy was to create characters, personas, fake German broadcasters who sounded more German than the official stations, who spoke the language of the streets, who complained about the same things ordinary soldiers complained about. Not ideological complaints, not moral arguments, practical complaints, visceral complaints, the kind that made your blood boil. Why are the party bosses getting fat while we're starving? Why are officers living in luxury while we're dying in the mud? Why are certain people getting exemptions while we're being sent to freeze in Russia? Who's sleeping with our wives while we're at the front? Greed, lust, envy, corruption, betrayal. These were the weapons Delmer would use. But he needed voices, authentic German voices. And that's where the defectors came in. Throughout the war, German soldiers and officers defected to Britain for various reasons. Some were captured and turned. Some were anti-Nazis who fled. Some were opportunists who saw which way the wind was blowing. The PWE collected them all. Delmer would interview them for hours, learning their stories, their dialects, their personalities, their grievances. and then he would cast them as characters in his propaganda opera. One of his first recruits was a man who would become known as Der Chef, the chief. His real name doesn't matter. What mattered was his voice and his character. Der Chef was scripted to be an old-school Prussian officer, a hardcore nationalist who had fought in World War I, a man who loved Germany but hated the Nazi Party, a man who believed the party communists, as he called them, were destroying everything Germany stood for. He wasn't anti-Hitler. That would have been too obvious, too unbelievable. Instead, he blamed everyone around Hitler, the corrupt bureaucrats, the cowardly SS officers, the profiteers getting rich off the war. He positioned himself as a true patriot, trying to save Germany from the parasites. It was brilliant, because it gave German listeners permission to be angry without being treasonous. You could hate the corruption without hating the fatherland. You could be a loyal soldier and still believe the system was broken. Delmer wrote the scripts, carefully crafted rants that mixed truth with lies so smoothly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. He included real news about defeats and casualties that German official channels were hiding. That established credibility. And then, once the listener trusted the source, he would slip in the poison, the lies, the rumors, the psychological sabotage. But here's what made Delmer's approach revolutionary. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't gentlemanly. He was vulgar, crude, shocking. Traditional British propaganda was polite, dignified, proper, and completely ineffective. Delmer understood that people remember the outrageous, the shocking, the taboo. So his broadcasts included content that made British officials blush, sexual content, profanity, graphic descriptions of corruption and betrayal. He talked about party officials sleeping with soldiers' wives. He described in detail the luxurious meals being served to Nazi elites while soldiers ate sawdust bread. He claimed certain officers were deliberately sending men to die so they could steal their possessions. Was it true? Some of it. Was it exaggerated? Absolutely. Did it work? Devastatingly well. Because humans are wired to believe the worst about people in power, especially when things are going badly, especially when they're cold and hungry and afraid. The broadcast confirmed what soldiers already suspected, that they were being used, that they were expendable, that the people giving orders didn't care if they lived or died. And once that belief takes root, discipline crumbles, trust erodes, the chain of command weakens. That was the goal. Not to make Germans love Britain, but to make them hate their own leaders, to turn the German war machine against itself. Delmer set up his first radio station in late 1941. It was called Gustav Siegfried I, GS1. The call sign was deliberately chosen to sound like a military designation, official, authorized. The transmitter was powerful enough to reach deep into German-occupied territory, and the content was calibrated to hook listeners immediately. Music first, the best music, American jazz, British swing, the stuff Germans weren't supposed to hear. That established that this was a rebellious station, a station that didn't follow the rules. Then news, real news about the war, including German defeats that official channels were hiding or spinning. That established credibility. Then Der Chef would come on, ranting about corruption, naming names, telling stories, making accusations, getting angrier and angrier. And German soldiers listened, in their barracks, in their foxholes, in their tanks. They listened because it sounded real, because it sounded like one of them, because it gave voice to their rage and fear. The German authorities noticed. They warned soldiers not to listen. They called it enemy propaganda. They threatened punishment for anyone caught tuning in. But that just made it more attractive. Forbidden fruit always tastes sweeter. Goebbels himself mentioned the station in his diary. He called it clever. Coming from the master of propaganda, that was high praise, and a sign that it was working. Delmer had created something new. Not propaganda that tried to convert, but propaganda that tried to corrupt, to poison, to dissolve loyalty from within. He was just getting started. Gustav Siegfried I went live in May 1941. The first broadcast opened with static, then music, then a voice that would become infamous among those who knew to listen. Der Chef, the chief. The character was perfect, harsh, angry, unapologetic. He spoke like a man who had seen too much and no longer cared about consequences, a man who loved Germany too much to watch it be destroyed by fools and cowards. His opening rant set the tone for everything that would follow. "Listen to me, you fools. While you're freezing your asses off in Russia, do you know what the party big shots are doing back home? They're eating your food, they're drinking your wine, and they're sleeping with your women." No preamble, no introduction, just raw, visceral anger. The kind that grabs you by the throat and doesn't let go. I've seen the reports, I know the truth, and I'm done staying silent. Someone has to tell you what's really happening, because the official channels sure as hell won't. The broadcasts were carefully structured. Delma understood that you couldn't just rant for an hour. You had to give listeners what they wanted: entertainment, information, validation. And then, when they were hooked, you gave them the poison. Each show followed a pattern. Music first, the latest American jazz, British dance bands, music that was officially forbidden, but that everyone secretly loved. That got people tuning in, that made them feel like rebels just for listening. Then came the news, and here's where Delma's genius really showed. The news was accurate, brutally accurate. If there had been a major defeat on the Eastern Front, GS1 reported it, with details, with casualty numbers, with specifics that the official German radio either buried or lied about. This was crucial, because once listeners realized that GS1 was telling them the truth about things they could verify, they started to believe everything else the station said, even the lies. Then Der Chef would come on, and the real show would begin. Let me tell you about Reichsmarschall Göring. You know, the fat pig who promised us air superiority, the man who swore the enemy would never bomb Berlin. That same man owns 6 estates, 6. While you're eating potato peels, he's dining on roast duck. While you're sleeping in the mud, he's sleeping on silk sheets. True, yes. Göring's excess was well known, but Der Chef didn't stop at the truth. And do you know where he gets his food? From the military supply depot, the same depot that's supposed to be sending rations to you. He's got an entire staff of cooks stealing from the army larder, and when anyone complains, they disappear, transferred to the Eastern Front, or worse. Was this true? Parts of it. Göring did live lavishly, but the specific claims about stealing military rations? Those were embellishments, lies wrapped in truth, impossible to verify, but believable enough that soldiers would nod along. The broadcasts got more vulgar from there, deliberately, shockingly so. And while we're on the subject of Göring, let's talk about his little parties. I've got sources in Berlin. They tell me about the orgies, young actresses brought in for the entertainment of party officials, champagne flowing while soldiers drink rust water, women half their age willing to do anything for a food ration card. This was where Delma's strategy departed completely from traditional British propaganda. The BBC would never broadcast content like this. It was crude, it was sexual, it was outrageous, but it was also incredibly effective, because soldiers believed it. They wanted to believe it. It confirmed their worst suspicions. It gave them permission to feel rage, to feel betrayed, to question their leaders. Der Chef didn't just attack the party elite. He attacked specific groups within the Nazi hierarchy. The SS, the Gestapo, the party functionaries who never saw combat but wielded enormous power. The SS, the so-called elite. Do you know how you get into the SS? You need the right bloodline, the right connections. You don't need courage. You don't need skill. You just need to kiss the right arses and prove your ancestors were pure enough. He told stories. Whether they were true or not didn't matter. What mattered was that they felt true. I heard about an SS officer in Poland, Oberfuhrer Schmidt, real hero, never fired a shot in combat. But he's very good at executing unarmed civilians, women and children. That's his speciality. And you know what he got for it? A medal. A promotion. and a requisitioned mansion that used to belong to a Jewish banker. The broadcast also targeted the home front, the civilians, the party officials, anyone who wasn't suffering the way the soldiers were suffering. Your wives write you letters. They tell you everything is fine. They lie. Do you know why? Because they're afraid. Afraid that if they tell you the truth, the Gestapo will visit them. Your children are hungry. Your parents are cold. The ration cards don't cover enough food to survive. So what do people do? They trade on the black market. They steal. They prostitute themselves. Der Chef would then name names. Not just generic complaints, specific accusations against specific people. Party officials in specific cities, officers in specific units. Sometimes the names were real, sometimes they were invented. It didn't matter. The effect was the same. Paranoia, suspicion, the feeling that corruption was everywhere. Gauleiter Müller in Hamburg. You want to know how he's eating so well? He's got a deal with the dock workers. They steal from the shipments coming in. Food meant for the military, weapons meant for the front. They sell it on the black market, and Müller gets his cut. That's why his belly is fat, while your stomach is empty. Could this be verified? No. Would anyone dare investigate? Also no. And that was the beauty of it. The accusations existed in a space where they couldn't be proven or disproven. They just festered, spreading doubt and anger. But Delma's most effective tactic was something he called the dirty detail. The idea was simple. If you want people to believe a lie, make it specific, make it visceral, make it disgusting. General propaganda would say, party officials are corrupt. That's abstract, easy to dismiss. GS1 would say, party official Schneider in Munich has a mistress named Ingrid who works at the telephone exchange. He visits her every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon while his wife thinks he's in meetings. He brings her stolen chocolate and French perfume. Last week, a soldier saw them together and complained to his commanding officer. That soldier was transferred to a punishment battalion on the Eastern Front. See the difference? The second version creates a complete picture. Names, days, details. It feels real because it's specific, even though it's entirely fictional. The sexual content was especially effective. Delma understood that soldiers away from home for years were obsessed with the idea that other men might be sleeping with their wives. It was a primal fear, an irrational fear, but a powerful one. So GS1 fed that fear. While you're dying in Russia, Italian POWs are working in German factories, strong young men, and your wives are lonely. The party knows this. They encourage it. They want your women to be distracted, docile, so they don't complain about the war. Was this happening? In isolated cases, probably. Was it a deliberate party policy? Of course not. But the accusation worked because it touched on a deep anxiety. Der Chef also spread rumors about secret peace negotiations, about betrayals at the highest level, about Hitler's failing health, about coup plots. I have it on good authority that Himmler is planning to overthrow the Führer. He's in secret talks with the British. He wants to make a separate peace. He wants to save his own skin. And when the time comes, he'll sacrifice all of you to do it. None of this was true in 1941, but the rumor created suspicion, made people watch Himmler more carefully, made the Nazi leadership more paranoid about each other. The program included a segment called The Mailbag, where Der Chef read letters supposedly from German soldiers and civilians. These letters were entirely fabricated, but they sounded authentic. Dear Chief, I'm writing from the Eastern Front. Last week, our officer ordered us to attack a fortified Russian position. We lost 30 men in 10 minutes. Then we found out the officer was drunk when he gave the order. He was disciplined with a transfer to a cushy administrative post in Berlin. This is how our lives are valued. The cumulative effect was devastating. German soldiers listening to GS1 found their worst fears confirmed, their suspicions validated, their rage justified. And once that happened, discipline became harder to maintain. Orders were questioned. Officers were resented. The unity that any military requires began to fracture. German authorities tried to shut down the station. They jammed the frequencies. They threatened severe punishment for anyone caught listening. They denounced it as enemy propaganda. But they made a critical mistake. They never revealed that the station was British. They couldn't, because that would mean admitting that the British had penetrated German information space so completely that they could broadcast lies directly into soldiers' barracks. So instead, German propaganda claimed GS1 was a traitorous German station, a resistance movement, internal enemies, and that made it even more credible. If German authorities were so desperate to silence it, it must be telling the truth. Delmer had won the first round of the psychological war. Der Chef became a ghost that haunted the Wehrmacht, a voice in the darkness, a conscience that reminded soldiers of everything they were trying to forget.
That they were being used, that they were expendable, that the people giving them orders didn't care if they lived or died. Truth and lies blended so seamlessly that no one could tell the difference anymore. And that was exactly the point. Radio was just the beginning. Delmer and the PWE understood that psychological warfare required multiple vectors of attack. You couldn't just broadcast lies and hope they spread. You needed to plant them directly into the enemy's ecosystem, like seeds, like viruses. That's where the Sibs came in. The term comes from the Latin word sibillar, which means to hiss, like a serpent, a whisper, a rumor passed from person to person until no one remembers where it started, until it becomes accepted truth. Sibs were carefully crafted rumors designed to spread organically through neutral countries and eventually into German-occupied territory. They weren't shouted from rooftops, they were whispered in bars, mentioned casually in conversations, repeated until they took on a life of their own. The art of creating an effective Sib required understanding human psychology at its deepest level. What makes people want to share information? What makes a rumor irresistible? Delmer identified several key elements. First, the rumor had to be shocking but believable, too mundane and no one cares, too outrageous and no one believes it. The sweet spot was right in between, something that made you say, "I can't believe that's happening," while simultaneously thinking, "Actually, that makes sense." Second, it had to tap into existing fears or prejudices. You couldn't create a fear from nothing, but you could amplify what was already there. Germans were already suspicious of their leadership, already worried about betrayal, already anxious about the home front. Sibs exploited those existing anxieties. Third, it had to be specific enough to feel real, but vague enough to be unverifiable. Names without full details, places without exact addresses, dates without times. The rumor lived in that space where it couldn't be proven false, but felt true enough to believe. The PWE established a network of agents in neutral countries: Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Switzerland, Turkey. These countries were full of people with connections to Germany: diplomats, businessmen, refugees, spies, and importantly, ordinary Germans who traveled for work. PWE agents would approach these people, sometimes directly, sometimes through intermediaries, and they would feed them information. Presented not as propaganda, but as gossip, secrets they had heard, things they weren't supposed to know. I heard the most disturbing thing last week. Apparently, the SS has started a blood collection program. They're taking blood from wounded soldiers at field hospitals, but not for transfusions, for something else. There are rumors about experiments, about trying to synthesize youth serum for aging party leaders. Can you believe that? Sounds insane, but I heard it from someone who works at a Berlin hospital. The person receiving this information would be horrified, and they would tell someone else, who would tell someone else, and each retelling would add details, change specifics, but the core claim would remain. The party is literally draining soldiers' blood. Was it true? No, absolutely not. But was it believable in a regime that had already demonstrated its willingness to conduct human experiments? In a leadership that seemed to value power over human life? Uncomfortably close to believable. Another Sib targeted civilian morale. Have you heard about the suicide pills? The government is stockpiling them. They're planning to distribute them to families if the Allies invade. Official policy, better dead than conquered. They're not telling people yet, but the orders have already been issued. A friend of mine who works in the ministry saw the paperwork. This rumor was particularly insidious because it suggested the leadership believed the war was already lost, that they were preparing for defeat, and that their solution was mass suicide rather than surrender. It created panic. It made people question whether the optimistic official reports about the war were lies. It made them wonder if their leaders had given up on victory and were just trying to take everyone down with them. One of the most successful SIBs involved sharks. Yes, sharks. There's been a strange increase in shark sightings in the English Channel. Marine biologists are baffled, but some people think they know why. The sharks have tasted blood, human blood, from all the bodies in the water. Soldiers who drowned during the failed invasion attempts. The sharks have developed a taste for it. They're congregating there, waiting. The British don't even need defenses anymore. The water itself has become a killing ground. Absurd? Yes, but it tapped into primal fear, the terror of dark water, of being eaten alive. It made the idea of a cross-channel invasion even more psychologically daunting than it already was. The beauty of SIBs was their deniability. If caught spreading them, PWE agents could claim they had simply heard the rumor and were passing it along. They weren't the source. They were just repeating what they'd heard. And that's how rumors work. No one ever knows where they really started. The PWE also planted SIBs in letters, fake letters written as if from German soldiers or civilians. These letters would be introduced into the mail system through captured documents or through agents who had access to postal routes. They would be read by censors. And even if the letters were intercepted and never delivered, the censors would have read them. And censors talk. They share what they've seen, and the rumor spreads. My dearest Anna, I cannot write much. Censors read everything. But I must tell you, do not trust the ration system. The cards are being devalued soon. I heard this from an officer's aide. They are planning to cut rations by half, but they won't announce it. They'll just issue new cards that buy less food. Stock up now while you can. Tell no one I told you this. Burn this letter after reading. Letters like this created a run on food supplies, caused panic buying, disrupted the rationing system, all from a piece of paper that said things that weren't true. The PWE became expert at crafting SIBs that would appeal to different audiences. Rumors for soldiers, rumors for civilians, rumors for party officials, each tailored to exploit the specific anxieties of that group. For soldiers, rumors about betrayal and corruption, about officers sacrificing men for personal gain, about the home front falling apart. For civilians, rumors about impending disaster, about secret preparations for invasion, about food shortages worse than admitted. For party officials, rumors about internal power struggles, about Hitler's declining health, about factions plotting against each other. Each SIB was a small poison pill. Alone it might not do much damage, but hundreds of SIBs, spread over months and years, created a cumulative effect. A general atmosphere of suspicion and distrust, a sense that things were worse than officially acknowledged, a feeling that the leadership was lying. And in a dictatorship, that feeling is dangerous. Because dictatorships require absolute trust in the leader. Once that trust erodes, the whole system becomes unstable. The Germans tried to counter the SIBs. They issued warnings. They told people not to believe rumors. They arrested people caught spreading defeatist talk. But that just made the problem worse, because now people wondered why the government was so desperate to silence these rumors. If they were just lies, why the harsh reaction? The PWE also used SIBs to manipulate German intelligence. They would feed false information through channels they knew German spies were monitoring. Information about Allied plans, about troop movements, about supply shortages. The Germans would intercept this intelligence and make decisions based on it, decisions that played into Allied hands. One particularly clever SIB involved synthetic rubber. The Germans were desperate for rubber. Their natural supply lines had been cut. They were trying to develop synthetic alternatives. The PWE spread rumors through neutral scientific channels that the Allies had perfected a new synthetic rubber formula, that it was superior to anything Germany had, that it would give the Allies a decisive advantage. None of this was true, but German intelligence believed it. They diverted resources to counter a threat that didn't exist. They changed their strategy based on false information. That's the ultimate power of a good SIB. It doesn't just demoralize, it misdirects. It causes the enemy to waste time and resources chasing ghosts. The SIB network operated in the shadows. No one knew who was planting the rumors. No one could trace them back to their source. They just appeared, spread, multiplied, like an infection. And like an infection, they weakened the host from within. By 1943, SIBs had become one of the PWE's most effective weapons. Not as dramatic as a bombing raid, not as visible as a battlefield victory, but perhaps more corrosive in the long run. Because bombs destroy buildings, but rumors destroy minds. And in a war where morale was as important as ammunition, that made all the difference. In 1943, Sefton Delmer launched his masterpiece, a radio station so sophisticated, so convincing, that it became the most popular station in occupied Europe. German soldiers preferred it over their own official broadcasts. Even Joseph Goebbels admitted in his private diary that it was brilliantly done. Its name was Soldatensender Calais, Soldiers Station Calais. The name was deliberate. Calais was in occupied France. By naming the station after a German-controlled city, it implied the broadcast was coming from inside German territory. Authorized, official, safe to listen to. It wasn't. The transmitter was in England, but the Germans didn't know that, and by the time they figured it out, millions were already hooked. Soldatensender Calais was everything Gustav Siegfried Eins was, but refined, professional, polished, less overtly angry, more subtly subversive. The format was genius. It presented itself as an entertainment station for German troops, morale-boosting music, news from home, letters from families, sports results, everything a homesick soldier would want to hear. The music selection was impeccable. British and American jazz, German classical music, popular songs from before the war, the kind of music that reminded soldiers of home, of happier times, of what they were supposedly fighting to protect. Between songs, there would be announcements, cheerful, upbeat, encouraging. To all our brave soldiers on the Eastern Front, your families back home are proud of you. Keep your spirits up. Victory is within reach. It sounded like official military radio, but it wasn't. Then came the news. And this is where the magic happened. Soldatensender Calais broadcast the most accurate military news available, more accurate than official German radio. Because the PWE had access to Allied intelligence, they knew which cities had been bombed, which units had been destroyed, which offensives had failed. And they reported it, truthfully, quickly, often before official German channels. If an Allied bombing raid hit a German city at 10 in the morning, Soldatensender Calais would report it by noon, with details, how many bombers, what areas were hit, estimated casualties, everything a soldier would want to know if his family lived in that city. Official German radio, meanwhile, would delay the announcement for days, would downplay the damage, would lie about the casualty figures. Soldiers quickly learned that if they wanted real news, they listened to Soldatensender Calais. And once they trusted the station for news, they believed everything else it broadcast. That's when the poison came in. Soldatensender Calais didn't rant like Gustav Siegfried Eins. It didn't scream about corruption. Instead, it whispered. It suggested. It raised questions without explicitly making accusations. We've received reports that the 7th Panzer Division suffered heavy casualties in yesterday's engagement. Official sources say the attack was a success, but our sources indicate that over 60% of the unit was lost. We hope for the sake of the families that the official version is true. But soldiers on the ground know what really happened. See the technique? Present two versions, the official lie and the unofficial truth. Let the listener decide which to believe, but make it clear which one is probably accurate. The station also broadcast what it called personal messages. These sounded like letters from home, read by announcers in warm, sympathetic voices. Frau Gertrude Schmidt from Hamburg asks us to relay a message to her husband, Unteroffizier Hans Schmidt of the 12th Infantry Regiment. She writes, "My dearest Hans, I hope this finds you well. The children miss you terribly. Little Klaus asks about you every day. I want you to know that we are managing. The house was damaged in last week's raid, but we are staying with my sister. Do not worry about us. Just come home safely. Our hearts go out to Frau Schmidt and her family. Touching, emotional, completely fabricated. There was no Frau Schmidt, no message. But thousands of soldiers heard it and thought of their own families, their own homes that might be damaged, their own children who missed them. It created homesickness, anxiety, distraction, the opposite of combat readiness.
But Soldatenende Calais' most effective tactic was something the PWE called useful fiction. This was military information that sounded like it came from German command, but was actually carefully crafted deception. For example, during the Battle of the Atlantic, the station would broadcast what sounded like coded messages to U-boat commanders. Attention, Captain Müller, U-537. New coordinates for rendezvous point. Grid reference 4397. Acknowledge receipt. U-boats listening would hear this and wonder, who is Müller? Is that a real boat? Should we acknowledge? Are we compromising our position if we respond? Sometimes the coordinates were real locations where Allied anti-submarine patrols were concentrated. Any U-boat investigating would sail directly into danger. Sometimes the messages contained subtle navigation errors, degrees slightly off, compass headings that would lead boats into minefields. The beauty was that U-boat commanders couldn't ignore the messages entirely. What if some were real? What if their own command was using this channel for emergency communications? They had to at least consider the possibility. And that consideration, that moment of confusion, was often enough to disrupt operations. Soldatenende Calais also broadcast false retreat orders. During major battles, when German forces were under pressure, the station would suddenly announce that certain units had been ordered to fall back to new defensive positions. Urgent message for all units of the 15th Army. High Command has ordered tactical withdrawal to secondary positions. All units are to disengage and regroup. Acknowledge and execute immediately. Chaos, confusion. Some units would follow the order, others would ignore it. Some commanders would waste time trying to verify it with actual command. And in that confusion, Allied forces would press their advantage. The Germans eventually realized Soldatenende Calais was enemy propaganda.
They issued orders forbidding soldiers from listening. They tried to jam the frequency. They warned that anyone caught tuning in would face court-martial. But the station was too popular, too useful, too entertaining. Soldiers kept listening, in secret, with the volume low, headphones on, pretending they were just fiddling with the dial. Because the truth was, Soldatenende Calais gave them something German radio didn't. Honest news, good music, a sense that someone was speaking to them as human beings rather than as expendable tools. The PWE constantly refined the content based on intelligence about what German soldiers were talking about. If reports indicated soldiers were worried about a specific topic, the station would address it. If a particular rumor was spreading, they would amplify it or redirect it. They also used the station to spread disinformation about Allied capabilities, to make the Germans overestimate Allied strength, to create phantom armies that didn't exist, to convince commanders that attacks were coming from directions where no attacks were planned. Before the D-Day invasion, Soldatenende Calais was crucial in the deception operation known as Fortitude, the plan to convince the Germans that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. The station broadcast references to fictional army units supposedly preparing for the Calais landing. It reported on training exercises in southeast England. It mentioned supply build-ups consistent with a major cross-channel assault at the narrowest point. German intelligence listened carefully. They tracked the references. They built order of battle assessments based on what they heard. They positioned their forces to defend Calais. And when the real invasion came at Normandy, those forces were in the wrong place. That's the power of sophisticated propaganda. It doesn't just demoralize, it deceives. It manipulates enemy decision-making. It turns the enemy's intelligence apparatus against itself. Soldatensender Calais continued broadcasting until the war's end. Millions of listening hours, countless disrupted operations, immeasurable psychological damage. It represented the evolution of black propaganda, from crude anger to refined manipulation, from shouting to whispering, from obvious lies to subtle distortions of truth. Delmer had created a weapon that worked precisely because it didn't seem like a weapon. It seemed like a friend, a reliable source, a voice that understood what soldiers were going through. And once you trust a voice, you believe what it tells you, even when what it's telling you is designed to destroy you from within. Radio waves weren't the only vectors of psychological attack. The PWE understood that soldiers and civilians encounter information in multiple forms: spoken, written, printed, visual. To truly penetrate enemy consciousness, they needed to control all these channels. That's where the forgers came in. Deep beneath London, in converted bunkers and basement workshops, a team of artists and technicians worked on what they called the paper war. Their mission was to create physical propaganda so convincing that even experts couldn't tell it from the real thing. Forged documents, fake newspapers, counterfeit ration cards, false identity papers, altered photographs, everything that might undermine German authority or disrupt German life. The team included some of Britain's most talented artists, people who could replicate any typeface, match any paper stock, reproduce any official seal or signature. They were master craftsmen in the art of deception. Their first major project was forged ration cards. Ration cards were the lifeblood of the German home front. Without them, you couldn't buy food, couldn't get clothing, couldn't survive. The system was tightly controlled. The cards had watermarks, security features, serial numbers, very difficult to counterfeit. But the PWE team managed it. They obtained real German ration cards through agents in neutral countries. They analyzed the paper composition, they matched the ink, they reproduced the printing plates, and then they printed thousands of perfect forgeries. These cards were then distributed through the underground, resistance networks in occupied territories. They were given to refugees, to deserters, to anyone who might use them to survive outside the official system. The effect was twofold. First, it helped people the Germans wanted to control. Second, it flooded the market with fake cards, making the entire rationing system unreliable. German authorities couldn't tell real cards from fake ones. They had to assume some percentage of all transactions were fraudulent. Trust in the system eroded. The PWE also forged postage stamps. Not ordinary stamps, special propaganda stamps designed to look like official German issues, but with subtle alterations that conveyed subversive messages. The most famous example featured Heinrich Himmler's face instead of Hitler's. The stamp looked official, same size, same color, same design as regular German stamps. But where Hitler's portrait usually appeared, there was Himmler. These stamps were distributed in small numbers, slipped into mail systems, used on letters sent within Germany. Most people wouldn't notice immediately, but eventually someone would look closely and realize what they were seeing. The implication was obvious. Himmler is planning to replace Hitler. This is the new regime's stamp. The coup is coming. Was there a coup plot? Not at that time, but the stamp suggested there might be. And in a dictatorship built on paranoia, even the suggestion of disloyalty was dangerous. Hitler and Himmler's relationship became more strained. Hitler became more suspicious. Himmler had to constantly prove his loyalty, all because of a few forged stamps. Another project involved fake military documents, orders, memos, reports, all on perfect reproductions of German military letterhead. These documents were introduced into military channels through captured officers who had been turned, or through agents who had access to military mail systems. Some documents contained false information about Allied strength, exaggerated casualty figures for German units, reports of partisan activity where there was none. The goal was to make German commanders waste resources investigating threats that didn't exist, or defending against attacks that weren't coming. Other documents were more insidious. They were orders that created confusion and distrust. For example, a forged order might instruct a particular unit to report to a different command structure. When the unit followed the order, chaos ensued. The new command didn't know what to do with them. The old command wondered why they'd left. Everyone wasted time sorting out the confusion. Or an order might promote certain officers over others, creating resentment and suspicion about favoritism and internal politics. The PWE's most ambitious forgery project was creating an entire fake newspaper. Not just one issue, an ongoing publication that mimicked a real German underground newspaper. The newspaper was called Das Neue Deutschland, the New Germany. It was supposedly published by anti-Nazi Germans who wanted to see Hitler overthrown and replaced with a more moderate government. Each issue was carefully crafted to look authentic. It included articles criticizing specific Nazi policies. It featured cartoons mocking party officials. It published poetry and essays about a better Germany. It looked exactly like an underground resistance publication, but it wasn't. It was written and printed in London, and then distributed in Germany through airdrops and smuggling networks. The articles were sophisticated. They didn't call for Germany to lose the war. They called for Germany to save itself by getting rid of the Nazi leadership. They appealed to patriotism, not defeatism. They suggested that the real traitors were the men sending German boys to die for their own power. This was brilliant, because it gave German citizens a way to oppose the regime without feeling like they were betraying their country. You could hate the Nazis and still love Germany. The newspaper provided intellectual and moral cover for dissent. The PWE also created fake leaflets, supposedly issued by different branches of the German military or government. These leaflets would give contradictory information about air raid procedures, or conflicting instructions about curfews, or different versions of official news. The goal was to create an atmosphere where Germans didn't know what to believe, where every official document might be real or might be fake, where trust in written authority collapsed. Perhaps the most controversial PWE forgery project was something called the Malady Manual. It was a small booklet that taught German soldiers how to fake illness to get sent home from the front. The manual was disguised as a medical reference guide. It listed various conditions, symptoms to report, tests to fail, how to induce temporary ailments that would seem serious enough to warrant medical evacuation. For example, it explained how to raise your temperature before a medical examination by exercising vigorously and then immediately taking the thermometer. How to fake symptoms of trench foot by keeping your feet wet and immobile. How to produce blood in your urine by biting your cheek and spitting into the sample. The manual was distributed near the front lines, dropped in supply crates, slipped into barracks, left where soldiers would find it and assume it came from sympathetic German medical staff. The British military establishment was uncomfortable with this project. It seemed cowardly. It encouraged enemy soldiers to avoid their duty through deception. It wasn't gentlemanly. But Delmer argued that if German soldiers were faking illness, they weren't fighting. Every soldier sent home on false medical grounds was one fewer enemy combatant, and it was far more humane than killing them. The logic won out. The manual was distributed, and intelligence reports suggested it was used. German medical officers complained about a suspicious increase in certain types of illnesses. Investigations were launched. But you can't prove someone is faking symptoms without risking sending genuinely sick soldiers back to combat. The system became overwhelmed. The paper war extended to identity documents as well. The PWE forged German military ID cards, travel permits, work authorization papers. These documents were given to Allied agents operating behind enemy lines, to escaped POWs trying to make their way back to Allied territory, to Jews and other persecuted people trying to flee. These forgeries saved lives, real lives. People who would have been caught and killed survived because British forgers were good at their jobs. But they also created chaos in German internal security. If papers could be forged this convincingly, how could authorities tell who was legitimate and who was an infiltrator? Everyone became suspect. ID checks became more frequent, more thorough, more paranoid, which meant German security forces spent more time checking their own citizens and less time actually hunting spies. The cumulative effect of the paper war was the degradation of trust in physical documentation. In a bureaucratic state like Nazi Germany, paperwork was everything. Orders, permits, certificates. The whole system ran on paper, and the PWE made that paper unreliable. It was a subtle form of warfare. No explosions, no casualties, just confusion, doubt, inefficiency. Systems breaking down because no one knew what was real anymore. The paper war continued throughout the conflict. Printing presses running 24 hours a day, forgers perfecting their craft, agents distributing the products behind enemy lines. By war's end, the PWE had produced millions of forged documents. Some estimates suggest that up to 10% of certain types of German administrative paperwork circulating in the final years was actually British forgeries. 10%. That means 1 in every 10 documents a German official handled might be fake, might contain false information, might be designed to mislead or disrupt. How do you run a government under those conditions? How do you maintain control when you can't trust your own paperwork? You can't, not effectively. And that was exactly the point. The paper war proved that psychological operations didn't need to be loud. Sometimes the quietest weapons were the most destructive. A whisper on paper could shout louder than any radio broadcast. By 1944, Britain faced a new threat, a weapon so advanced, so terrifying, that there was no conventional defense against it. The V weapons. V for Vergeltungswaffe, vengeance weapons. First came the V-1, a pilotless aircraft packed with explosives, a cruise missile before cruise missiles had a name. It flew like a plane but without a pilot, loud, distinctive. The engine would cut out just before impact. That silence meant death was seconds away. Then came the V-2, a true rocket, supersonic, no warning, no sound, just sudden explosive destruction falling from the sky. The first ballistic missile used in warfare. London was the primary target. The missiles fell day and night, hitting homes, schools, hospitals, killing randomly, creating terror. The British military tried everything to stop them. Fighter planes pursued the V-1s, anti-aircraft guns shot them down, but the V-2s were unstoppable. By the time you heard the explosion, you were already dead or safe. No defense was possible. Except one: psychological warfare. The PWE realized something crucial. The Germans were adjusting their aim based on damage reports. If they thought the missiles were hitting their targets, they'd keep firing at the same coordinates. But if they believed the missiles were landing somewhere else, they'd adjust. So the British decided to lie about where the missiles were landing. Through the double-cross system, Britain controlled German spies operating in the UK. These weren't German agents sending real intelligence back to Berlin. They were German agents who had been caught, turned, and were now sending whatever information the British wanted Berlin to believe. These double agents began reporting that the V weapons were overshooting their targets, landing north of London, in the less densely populated suburbs and countryside beyond the city centre. The reports were detailed: specific street names, estimated coordinates, casualty figures, everything a German commander would need to adjust aim. The Germans believed the reports. Why wouldn't they? These were their own agents, trusted sources, operating in enemy territory at great personal risk. So the Germans adjusted their aim. They shortened the range. They aimed further south. The missiles stopped hitting central London, Westminster, the government district, the financial centre, the densely populated areas where casualties would be highest. Instead, they fell on the southern suburbs, the outskirts, the less populated areas. Thousands of lives were saved. The political and economic centre of London was protected. The war effort continued undisrupted. But people still died. In the suburbs, in the areas the missiles were redirected to, real people, with real families, who had done nothing wrong except live in the wrong postal code. The British government knew this would happen. They calculated it. They accepted it. They decided that more deaths in the suburbs were preferable to fewer deaths in the centre. This was the cold mathematics of psychological warfare, the vampire economy, sacrificing some to save others, choosing who lived and who died based on strategic value. The decision was never announced publicly. The people living in the newly targeted areas were never told they were being deliberately put in harm's way. They just experienced an increase in attacks, random, unexplained, bad luck. Except it wasn't luck, it was policy. This operation raised profound moral questions, questions the PWE and British leadership wrestled with in secret, questions that were never fully resolved. Is it acceptable to deliberately redirect enemy fire onto your own civilians, even if it saves more lives overall, even if the alternative is worse? Is it acceptable to lie to your own people about the danger they face? To let them believe the attacks are random when they're actually the result of calculated deception? Where is the line between legitimate military strategy and morally bankrupt sacrifice? The PWE argued that this was no different from any other military decision. Commanders always make choices about where to defend and where to leave vulnerable. Always calculate acceptable losses. This was just more explicit about it. Critics within the government argued that there was a difference between failing to defend an area and actively redirecting enemy fire toward it. That crossing that line made Britain no better than the regime it was fighting. The operation continued, because war doesn't pause for philosophical debates, because in the moment, saving the government and military command structure seemed more important than protecting suburbs. The double agents continued feeding false information. The Germans continued adjusting their aim. The missiles continued falling on the wrong targets from Germany's perspective, the right targets from Britain's perspective. By the end of the war, it's estimated that the deception operation saved thousands of lives in central London, at the cost of hundreds of deaths in the suburbs that might not have occurred otherwise. Was it worth it? The people who died in Croydon or Orpington might have a different answer than the people who were saved in Westminster. But beyond the immediate tactical success, the V-weapon deception represented something darker about psychological warfare. It showed that once you start manipulating information, there's no clear stopping point. Once you accept that lying is justified, you can justify any lie. Lying to the enemy becomes lying to your own intelligence services, becomes lying to your own government, becomes lying to your own citizens. The boundaries blur. The PWE used similar tactics in other contexts. They spread false information about Allied troop concentrations, about supply routes, about planned offensives. Sometimes, this misdirection resulted in German forces being positioned away from actual Allied operations, which meant fewer Allied casualties. But it also sometimes resulted in German forces attacking empty positions or civilian areas where they thought military targets existed, which meant civilian casualties that wouldn't have occurred if the Germans had accurate intelligence. Every lie had consequences, some intended, some unintended, some acceptable, some deeply troubling. The leadership rationalized these choices by pointing to the greater evil. Nazi Germany was committing genocide, waging wars of conquest, enslaving populations. Any tactic that shortened the war and hastened Nazi defeat was morally justified because it reduced the total amount of suffering. That logic is sound in the abstract, but it becomes more complicated when you're the one making the specific choice, when you're the one drawing the line on a map that determines who lives and who dies. The people making these decisions at the PWE weren't monsters. They were ordinary men and women doing an extraordinary job under extraordinary circumstances. They believed they were fighting for a just cause. They believed the ends justified the means. But they also knew that some of the means they employed were morally grey at best. They knew that history might judge them harshly. They knew they were crossing lines that shouldn't be crossed lightly, and they crossed them anyway. Because they believed they had no choice, because in total war, there are no clean options, only less terrible ones. The V-weapon deception remained classified for decades after the war. When it was finally revealed, it sparked renewed debate. Some historians praised it as a brilliant tactical success. Others condemned it as an unconscionable sacrifice of civilian lives. Both perspectives have merit. That's what makes it so troubling. The vampire economy was about more than just the V-weapons. It was about the entire psychological warfare apparatus. Every lie broadcast on Soldatensender Calais might have caused a German soldier to hesitate at a crucial moment, which might have saved an Allied soldier's life, but also might have caused that German soldier to be shot by his own officers for suspected cowardice or disloyalty. Every forged document might have helped a refugee escape, but also might have gotten an innocent German arrested when authorities tightened security in response to the forgeries. Every Sib might have undermined German morale, but also might have made German forces more desperate and therefore more brutal in their actions. Cause and effect in psychological warfare are impossible to trace clearly. The consequences ripple outward in ways no one can fully predict or control. That's the danger of fighting in the realm of the mind. Bullets travel in straight lines. Lies spread in unpredictable patterns. The PWE understood this. They accepted it. They did it anyway. Because the alternative was losing the war. And losing the war meant Nazi victory. And Nazi victory meant horrors beyond calculation. When faced with that calculus, most chose to fight dirty, to cross moral lines, to accept collateral damage in the realm of truth and information, just as they accepted collateral damage on physical battlefields. Whether that choice was right or wrong depends on where you stand, on what you value, on how you weigh one type of harm against another. The PWE made their choice. They saved London's centre by sacrificing its suburbs. They undermined enemy morale by spreading corrosive lies. They won tactical victories through strategic deception, and they paid the price in moral complexity that haunts us still. May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The war against Nazi Germany was over. Cities erupted in celebration. Soldiers embraced. Civilians danced in the streets. Churchill addressed the nation. The nightmare had ended. But in a quiet office building in London, there was no celebration. Instead, there was an urgent, methodical process of destruction. The political warfare executive was being erased from history. Orders came from the highest levels. The PWE had done its job, and now it needed to disappear. The files were to be burned. The operations were to be classified so deeply that they might as well have never existed. The people involved were to sign binding secrecy agreements and return to civilian life as if they had spent the war years doing ordinary administrative work. Sefton Delmer was told to be quiet, to never discuss what he had done, to let the world believe that Britain had won through courage and superior firepower, not through lies and manipulation. Why the cover-up? Why hide a successful operation? Because Britain's reputation depended on it. The British had positioned themselves as the defenders of truth and freedom. Churchill's speeches emphasized honor, dignity, and fighting the good fight. The image was of Britain standing alone against tyranny, refusing to compromise its values, even under existential threat. If the world learned that Britain had spent the war running sophisticated deception operations, spreading lies, forging documents, and deliberately manipulating both enemy and civilian populations, that image would be compromised. The moral high ground would be lost. So the files burned. Literally. Truckloads of documents, scripts, intelligence reports, operational summaries, personnel records. Thousands of pages documenting the most sophisticated psychological warfare operation in history, reduced to ash. Not everything was destroyed. Some files were kept, deeply classified, locked away in archives where they would remain secret for decades. But the vast majority was eliminated. The PWE wanted no trail, no evidence. No way for future historians to piece together what had really happened. The radio stations shut down, Gustav Siegfried Eins, Soldatensender Calais, all the others. One day they were broadcasting. The next day, silence. German listeners who had tuned in for years suddenly found dead air. No explanation, no sign-off, just gone. The forgers disbanded. The artists who had spent years perfecting German typefaces and watermarks went back to designing advertisements and book covers. The people who had crafted sibs returned to ordinary journalism. The voices who had played characters like Der Chef disappeared into anonymity. Delmer himself tried to write about the experience. After the mandatory secrecy period expired, he published a memoir. But by then, decades had passed. The urgency was gone. Few people cared about wartime propaganda operations when they were busy living in the Cold War and worrying about nuclear annihilation. But even though the PWE was officially dissolved, its techniques didn't disappear. They evolved. They migrated. They became the foundation for post-war intelligence operations. The CIA studied PWE methods when establishing its own psychological operations division. The KGB analyzed captured German intelligence files that described what the British had done. Both sides in the Cold War adopted and refined these tactics. The Sibyls became what we now call strategic disinformation. The fake radio stations became what we now call influence operations. The forged documents became what we now call deep fakes and manipulated media. The same techniques the PWE used to undermine Nazi Germany were soon being used by everyone against everyone, in peace as well as war, against foreign adversaries and domestic populations. Radio Free Europe, Voice of America, Radio Moscow. These were the spiritual successors to Soldatensender Calais, broadcasting into enemy territory, mixing truth with propaganda, building trust to gain influence. The paper war evolved into digital warfare. Instead of forging stamps, modern operators manipulate photos and videos. Instead of printing fake newspapers, they create fake websites and social media accounts. Instead of distributing leaflets by airplane, they spread memes through the internet. But the psychology remains the same. Create doubt, exploit existing divisions, confirm people's worst suspicions, make them distrust their own leaders more than they distrust foreign enemies. The PWE proved that this works, that you can undermine a society from within by weaponizing information, that lies wrapped in truth are more effective than obvious propaganda, that the best way to destroy an enemy is to make them destroy themselves. And once that knowledge existed, it couldn't be forgotten. Even if the files were burned, the lessons lived on. Today, we call it fake news, election interference, psychological operations, information warfare, hybrid warfare. Different terms for the same basic concept the PWE perfected 80 years ago. Foreign governments create fake social media accounts to spread divisive content in target countries. Intelligence agencies plant false stories in media outlets to manipulate public opinion. Political campaigns use sophisticated targeting to deliver different messages to different audiences. Messages carefully crafted to exploit individual psychological vulnerabilities. Every technique has precedent in the PWE playbook. The targets have changed, the technology has advanced, but the fundamental approach remains identical, and we're all vulnerable to it. Because the same psychological triggers that worked on German soldiers in 1943 still work today. The desire to believe we're being told secret truths, the eagerness to think we're smarter than the masses, the tendency to trust information that confirms what we already believe, the pleasure of sharing outrageous stories. The PWE understood human nature. They understood that people are more emotional than rational, more tribal than objective, more susceptible to manipulation than they want to admit, and they exploited that understanding ruthlessly. The moral questions raised by the PWE have never been resolved. When is lying in service of a greater good justified? Where is the line between legitimate influence and unacceptable manipulation? How do you prevent psychological warfare techniques developed for external enemies from being used against your own population? These questions are more relevant now than ever, because we live in an information environment where the PWE's techniques are used constantly, by governments, by corporations, by political movements, by anyone with resources and motivation. Every day we encounter messages designed to manipulate us, to make us angry, to make us afraid, to make us distrust our neighbors and institutions, to make us feel like we're under siege, to make us think that only certain sources can be trusted and everything else is lies. We're all living in a version of the psychological battlefield the PWE created. We're all potential targets of the mind war. The difference is, we don't have Nazis on the other side to justify the manipulation. We have other democracies, other citizens, other people who genuinely believe they're fighting for truth and justice, while using techniques designed to undermine truth and justice. The PWE won the battle for the German mind, but in doing so, they created weapons that are now pointed in every direction, including back at the societies that developed them. Sefton Delmer died in 1979. By then, the world had moved on. The psychological warfare techniques he pioneered had become standard practice, normalized, accepted as just part of modern information warfare. If he could see the world today, he might be proud of how effective his techniques proved to be. Or he might be horrified at how they've been abused. Probably both. The PWE's legacy is complicated. They helped win a war against genuine evil. They saved lives through clever deception. They proved that the mind could be as important a battlefield as any physical terrain. But they also opened Pandora's box. Once you demonstrate that systematic lying can be an effective tool, once you prove that populations can be manipulated through carefully crafted deception, once you show that truth is negotiable in service of strategic goals, you can't put that knowledge back in the box. The burned files didn't erase the lessons learned. They just ensured those lessons would be learned again and again, by everyone who studied the war, by everyone who wanted to fight in the shadows, by everyone who believed that ends justify means. We tell ourselves stories about World War II, stories about good versus evil, about heroes and villains, about the Allies fighting with honor against Nazi barbarism. Those stories are true, but they're not complete. The complete story includes the uncomfortable truth that winning required becoming, in certain ways, like the enemy, required lying, required manipulation, required sacrificing some to save others, required crossing moral lines that should never be crossed. The PWE fought in the shadows so that Britain could maintain its image as a light in the darkness. They did the dirty work so that others could keep clean hands. They burned the files so that history could remember only the heroic version. But the shadows remain, the techniques remain, the moral compromises remain, and every day, in ways subtle and obvious, we're still fighting the psychological war the PWE began, still struggling with the question of how to defeat lies without becoming liars, how to fight manipulation without becoming manipulators, how to defend truth in a world where truth has become just another weapon. The smoke may clear, but the scars remain. Thank you for joining us on the front lines. Subscribe to keep the investigation alive. This is the History Frontline. Dismissed.